On the walls of the Ramesseum, Ramesses II is shown winning one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. The Battle of Kadesh appears as a royal triumph, the pharaoh at the center of the chaos, enemies collapsing around him, the whole scene arranged to make one thing unmistakable. Ramesses had faced the Hittites, and he had prevailed. But the real difficulty lies in what survived alongside that victory image. The later diplomatic record does not look like the aftermath of a simple conquest. Egypt and the Hittites did not vanish into a clean winner and loser story. Hostilities continued. Eventually, the two powers reached a treaty, one of the most famous peace agreements of the ancient world. That treaty does not prove Ramesses lost, but it does make the monument harder to read as straightforward history. A battle carved on a temple wall is not a battlefield report. A royal poem is not a neutral archive. And a peace treaty does not sit easily alongside a simple story of conquest. The monument isn't useless. It is doing work. It preserves a version of events. It tells us how Ramesses wanted Kadesh to be seen. Once that image is placed beside other surviving traces, Kadesh looks less like a clean victory and more like a case study in how ancient power could turn a dangerous event into a lasting narrative. How did a contested battle become a victory carved in stone? At the Ramesseum, the Battle of Kadesh was not hidden away in an archive. It was made public, monumental, and permanent. The walls did not simply record that a battle had taken place. They placed the king at the center of a world in conflict. Ancient royal monuments were not passive surfaces. They stood in places where power could be seen, repeated, and ritualized. A victory scene on a temple wall did more than preserve memory. It helped shape it. So the first question is not whether the reliefs are beautiful, dramatic, or historically important. They are all of those things. The question is what kind of evidence they are. If the Ramesseum gives us Ramesses' victory, it gives it to us as royal display. The battle is presented already arranged around the king. The disorder of war has been turned into composition. The danger has been made legible. The outcome has been given a shape. That is what makes the image powerful. It is also what makes it necessary to test. Kadesh, however, was not just a scene on a wall. It was a real confrontation between Egypt and the Hittites, two powers struggling for influence in the Near East. The British Museum describes it as one of the great chariot battles of the ancient world, a clash in which both sides could claim victory. That alone makes the monumental certainty more difficult. A battle claimed by both sides is not the same as a battle whose meaning was obvious to everyone who survived it. A conflict that later leads into diplomacy is not easily reduced to a single triumphant image. The battlefield itself must be approached cautiously. Without deeper specialist support, we should not attempt to reconstruct every troop movement, chariot formation, or tactical decision. That would turn this investigation into the very thing it tries to avoid, a standard battle recap. The core point is simpler. The battle was large, dangerous, and contested. It belonged to a world of fast-moving chariot warfare, imperial ambition, and military risk. A king could command an army, but he could not command the chaos of battle in the same way he could command the surface of a temple wall. On the wall, the king appears as the solution to disorder. But the need to show him that way may itself be evidence that the disorder mattered. The Egyptian textual tradition deepens that problem. The Battle of Kadesh was not preserved only in relief. It also survived in Egyptian accounts known as the Bulletin and the Poem. A copy of the poem is preserved on Papyrus Sallier III, and the British Museum describes it as a narrative of the battle from an Egyptian perspective, at times centered closely on Ramesses himself. That is a different kind of trace from a carved image, but it is not a neutral one. The poem presents victory through the figure of Ramesses and through divine support, especially the aid of Amun-Ra. It is not just information about the battle. It is a royal story about danger, protection, and legitimacy. That makes the Egyptian account more interesting, not less. If it were only a flat announcement of victory, it would tell us less. But a story that turns danger into triumph can preserve the pressure of the event it is trying to control. It can show us how a king's vulnerability becomes raw material for royal greatness. The Egyptian account should not be treated as an accidental confession of defeat. It should not be dismissed as fiction. It is better understood as a crafted memory of crisis and recovery, a way of making the king's survival and success appear even more extraordinary. That is how royal ideology often works. It does not always erase danger. Sometimes it uses danger. The greater the threat, the greater the king who overcomes it. The reliefs show control. The texts help explain how control could be narrated, but they still begin from the same place, the Egyptian royal frame. The next challenge comes from what that frame leaves out. The Hittites cannot remain mere scenery in Ramesses' victory image. They were not simply an anonymous enemy mass placed there to make the pharaoh look larger. They were a major power in the Near East. Their empire, centered in Anatolia, was deeply involved in the political world of Syria and the Levant. In that world, Kadesh was not just a battlefield. It was part of a wider contest between great states. That matters because the Egyptian image is built to make the enemy manageable. The Hittites appear as the force Ramesses confronts and overcomes, but the political evidence does not allow them to disappear so neatly. The source base supports a cautious point. The Hittites remained a serious power after Kadesh. The battle did not simply erase them. It did not produce a clean Egyptian domination that made diplomacy unnecessary. The world after Kadesh still had to be negotiated. This does not mean we should invent a full Hittite battlefield account to balance the Egyptian one. The surviving material is not symmetrical, and we should not pretend that both sides left equally vivid battle narratives. But asymmetry is part of the evidence. Egypt gives us the monumental victory image. The Hittite world gives us a political counterweight, another great power whose continued presence complicates the Egyptian claim to simple triumph. The issue is no longer only what happened during the battle. It is what kind of world existed after it. That pressure leads to the treaty. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty is one of the most important surviving traces connected to the long aftermath of this conflict. It is often described as the first known peace treaty, though that phrase should be used carefully, because first depends on what survives and how we define treaty making. What matters here is not the title of first. What matters is that the treaty exists as a different kind of evidence. It is not a temple victory scene. It is not a heroic poem. It belongs to the world of diplomacy, negotiation, obligation, political survival, and mutual recognition. And it creates an obvious problem for the simplest version of Kadesh. If Ramesses' victory at Kadesh had produced straightforward domination, why does the later record lead us into diplomacy rather than conquest? The answer should not be overstated. The treaty did not immediately follow the battle. Hostilities continued after Kadesh, before Egypt and the Hittites reached a formal agreement. The treaty should not be used as a smoking gun that proves Ramesses lost. It should not be made to say more than it says. But it does make the monumental image harder to read as the whole story. A treaty belongs to a world in which both sides still matter. It suggests a political reality that cannot be reduced to the temple walls image of royal triumph. It shows that the aftermath of Kadesh was not a simple scene of one power disappearing beneath another. The treaty does not cancel the monument. It changes what the monument is evidence for. The reliefs and inscriptions are still valuable. The Egyptian accounts are still essential, but their value is not that they give us a clean window onto the battle as it happened. Their value is that they show how the battle was made into royal memory. Placed beside the treaty, the monument becomes less like an answer and more like an artifact of political need. The Egyptian record says, the king triumphed. The wider evidence says the outcome was contested. Neither side secured a decisive victory, and the relationship between the two powers continued through conflict and diplomacy. Those statements can coexist because they are not the same kind of statement. The temple wall projects order, kingship, divine favor, and permanence. The royal poem turns danger into a story that magnifies the king who survives it. The diplomatic treaty manages a relationship between powers that could not simply wish each other away. Together, those traces do not give us a single easy verdict. They give us a way to see how ancient history was shaped before it ever reached us. The Ramesseum wall shows Ramesses at the center of victory. Papyrus Sallier III and the Egyptian textual tradition preserve a royal account in which danger becomes triumph through the king and the god. The Hittite political world reminds us that Egypt's enemy remained a major power. The treaty shows that the aftermath belonged to diplomacy as much as to victory. Together, those traces do not simply expose a lie, they reveal a process. A dangerous and uncertain battle became a royal story. A contested outcome became an image of triumph. A political world that required negotiation was remembered, at least in Egypt's monumental language, as the arena of Ramesses' greatness. Rulers in the ancient world did not only fight for land, cities, borders, or tribute. They fought for the authority to define what their actions meant. They fought for the version of events that would be carved, copied, displayed, and remembered. Kadesh shows that this struggle over memory could begin almost immediately. Before modern historians argued over the battle, before museum labels and textbooks and documentaries, the battle had already been shaped by the people who needed it to mean something. For Ramesses, Kadesh could not remain only a messy confrontation with a powerful rival. It had to become proof of kingship. The monument made that claim visible. The text made it narratable. The temple made it durable. But the treaty keeps the claim from becoming too simple. It is the trace that pulls us back from the wall and reminds us of a political reality beyond the carved scene, a world where the Hittites still mattered, where hostilities continued, and where peace had to be negotiated. When we return to the Ramesseum, after that, the reliefs have changed. They no longer look like a straightforward report from a battlefield. They look like evidence of something more layered, the official memory of an event whose outcome was not as clean as the image made it seem. That does not make the monument less important. It makes it more revealing. The stone does not simply tell us that Ramesses wanted to be seen as victorious. It shows us how victory could be manufactured from danger, how memory could be built from uncertainty, and how a ruler could lose control of events without losing control of the story. Kadesh was not just fought with chariots. It was fought again in images, texts, archives, and treaties. The version that lasted longest was not necessarily the simplest truth of the battlefield. It was the version powerful enough to be carved into stone, yet complicated enough that the surviving evidence still lets us see the cracks.